The train lurched to a stop at Kingman Station, and Grace Olmstead pressed her gloved hand against the dusty window, her heart hammering so hard she thought the other passengers might hear it. She had traveled all the way from Boston to Arizona Territory in 1882, responding to a carefully worded advertisement that promised a new life with a rancher named Nathaniel, who described himself as 30 years old, strong, and looking for a gentle woman to share his homestead. The photograph he'd sent showed a young man with dark hair and confident eyes, standing beside a painted horse. Grace gathered her carpetbag and smoothed down her traveling dress, which had accumulated weeks of train dust, despite her best efforts. At 23, she knew she was getting old for marriage by Boston standards, where her prospects had dwindled after her father's mercantile business failed and left the family in debt. Her mother had passed 2 years prior, and her father followed 6 months later, leaving Grace with nothing but bills and the cold charity of distant relatives who made it clear she was a burden. The mail-order bride arrangement had seemed like Providence itself when she'd read about it in the newspaper. The Arizona heat hit her like a wall when she stepped off the train, so different from the humid summers back east. The platform was crowded with cowboys, miners, and townspeople going about their business. Grace scanned the crowd, looking for the young man from the photograph, her stomach tight with anticipation and nerves. "Miss Olmstead." She turned toward the voice and felt her breath catch. The man standing before her was not the young rancher from the photograph. He was older, probably in his late 40s, with silver threading generously through his dark hair. Deep lines creased the corners of his eyes and bracketed his mouth, speaking of years spent squinting into the sun and facing down hardships. He was tall and lean, his posture still strong despite his age, dressed in well-worn but clean working clothes and a brown leather vest. "I'm Austin Zimmerman," he said, removing his hat to reveal more of that salt and pepper hair. His eyes were gray, not the dark brown from the photograph, and they held a wary, apologetic expression. "I reckon you were expecting someone else." Grace felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. "I don't understand. Where is Nathaniel?" Austin's weathered face tightened with something that looked like pain. "Nathaniel was my son, Miss Olmstead. He died 3 months ago. Horse threw him and he hit his head on a rock. It was quick, if that's any comfort." The words seemed to come from very far away. Grace gripped her carpetbag tighter, feeling the world narrow to just this moment, this stranger, this terrible news. "Why didn't you write to tell me? I've been traveling for weeks." "I did write," Austin said quietly. "Sent 3 letters to your Boston address. I reckon they arrived after you'd already left." Grace stood frozen on the platform, passengers flowing around them like water around stones. Everything she'd planned, everything she'd hoped for, crumbled like sand. She had no money for return passage. She had no home to return to even if she did. The relatives who'd grudgingly housed her after her father's death had made it abundantly clear. They considered their duty discharged once she'd agreed to this arrangement. "I have money set aside for your return passage," Austin said, as if reading her thoughts. "It's the least I can do. Nathaniel entered into an agreement with you, and even though he's gone, I aim to honor his obligations. There's a hotel in town where you can stay while we arrange things." She should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt hollow. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Zimmerman. Just Austin, please." He picked up her trunk, which the porter had deposited beside them. "Come on, let's get you out of this heat." Grace followed him down the dusty main street of Kingman, taking in the wooden storefronts, the saloons, the general store, and the bank. It was nothing like Boston's brick buildings and cobblestone streets, but there was a raw vitality to it that would have excited her under different circumstances. Now, it just felt foreign and overwhelming. The hotel was modest but clean. Austin paid for a room for a week, speaking quietly to the clerk, and then carried Grace's trunk upstairs himself. "I'll leave you to rest," he said, setting the trunk down in the small room. "I'm sure you're exhausted from traveling. I'll come by tomorrow morning to discuss arrangements." "Wait," Grace heard herself say. Austin paused in the doorway, his hat in his hands. "Tell me about him, about Nathaniel." Something shifted in Austin's face, a raw grief breaking through his composed exterior. He was quiet for a long moment, and Grace thought he might refuse. Then he stepped back into the room, though he didn't sit. "Nathaniel was everything good," Austin said simply. "After his mother died, bringing him into this world, I raised him on my own. He was smart, kind, always saw the best in people. He loved horses, loved the land. He was excited about you coming, Miss Olmstead. Talked about it every day, made plans, fixed up the house until it was prettier than it had been in 20 years. Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm so sorry for your loss." "And I'm sorry for yours," Austin said. "You lost something too, coming all this way with hopes and dreams only to have them dashed. That's a kind of grief as well." The understanding in his voice nearly undid her. Grace sat down on the bed, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. "I don't know what to do now." "You don't have to decide anything tonight," Austin said gently. "Rest. We'll figure things out in the morning." After he left, Grace lay down on the bed fully clothed and stared at the ceiling. She should have cried, but the tears wouldn't come. She felt suspended in some strange in-between place, neither here nor there, belonging nowhere. The next morning, Austin appeared at her door at 9 o'clock sharp, carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. "I thought you might not have eaten," he said. "Mrs. Chen at the boarding house packed some breakfast." They sat in the hotel's small dining room, and Grace discovered she was ravenous. The food was simple but good: fresh bread, cheese, apples, and some kind of dried meat. "I've been thinking," Austin said after they'd eaten in surprisingly comfortable silence. "You said you have no family back in Boston. Is that right? My father's cousin and his wife took me in after Papa died, but they made it clear I was a temporary arrangement. They have 6 children of their own and limited means." Austin nodded slowly. "Kingman's not a big town, but it's growing. There are opportunities here for a woman of good character. Mrs. Peterson, who runs the schoolhouse, has been looking for an assistant. The general store sometimes needs help. And Mrs. Chen is always looking for someone to help at the boarding house." Grace looked at him sharply. "You're suggesting I stay?" "I'm suggesting you have options," Austin said carefully. "Going back to Boston, where you're not wanted, versus staying here and building a new life. Both have their challenges, but at least here you'd have a chance at something of your own." "I don't know anyone here." "You know me," Austin said, "and I give you my word I'll help you however I can. No strings attached, Miss Olmstead. I owe that to Nathaniel, and more than that, it's just the right thing to do." Grace studied his face, searching for any hint of ulterior motive, but found only sincerity and that deep well of grief they now shared. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" "Because Nathaniel wanted you to have a good life here," Austin said simply. "He chose you from dozens of letters because something in your words spoke to him. He said you sounded brave and honest and kind. If he saw that in you, then you deserve a chance to make something of yourself out here." The decision formed in Grace's mind before she fully realized she was making it. "I'd like to stay then, at least for a while, to see if I can make a go of it." Austin's expression lightened with something that might have been relief. "Good, that's good. I'll introduce you to Mrs. Peterson this afternoon if you're up for it." Mrs. Peterson turned out to be a stern-faced woman in her 50s, who looked Grace up and down with sharp eyes before peppering her with questions about her education and experience with children. Grace answered honestly about her schooling at a girls' academy in Boston and her work helping teach Sunday school at her church. "Can you start Monday?" Mrs. Peterson asked abruptly. "Monday? Yes, of course. Room and board included plus $3 a week. Hours are 7 to 4 on weekdays. You'll help the younger children with their letters and numbers while I work with the older students." Grace felt something flutter in her chest that might have been hope. "Thank you, Mrs. Peterson. I won't disappoint you." After they left the schoolhouse, Austin offered to show Grace around town properly. Kingman was smaller than she'd expected, just a few streets clustered around the railroad depot, but it had a surprising energy to it. Austin introduced her to the shopkeepers, the banker, the blacksmith, and Mrs. Chen at the boarding house, who immediately offered Grace a room at a reduced rate since she'd be working at the school. "You know everyone," Grace observed as they walked. "Been here since before Kingman was officially Kingman," Austin said. "Came out from Texas in '65, right after the war ended. Nathaniel was born in '67. Watched this town grow from a handful of buildings to what it is now. You must have seen a lot of changes, too many to count." He paused outside the general store. "I need to pick up some supplies before I head back to the ranch. You're welcome to come along for the ride if you'd like to see the property. Might help you understand what Nathaniel's life would have been like." Grace hesitated, then nodded. Some part of her needed to see it, to understand what might have been. The ranch was about an hour outside of town, accessible by a dusty road that cut through scrubland dotted with mesquite and palo verde trees. The landscape was harsh but beautiful in its own way, all golden earth and endless sky. Grace had never seen such wide, open spaces. The ranch house itself was modest, built of adobe with a wooden porch that ran along the front. But Austin had been right about Nathaniel's improvements. Fresh paint brightened the shutters and someone had built planter boxes beneath the windows, though the flowers had withered in the heat. "He built those for you," Austin said quietly, nodding at the planters. "Thought you might want to grow flowers or herbs." Grace felt her throat tighten. She climbed down from the wagon and walked up to the porch, running her fingers along the smooth wood railing. "Would you like to see inside?" Austin asked. The interior was dim and cool after the bright sunlight. One large room served as kitchen and living area, with two smaller bedrooms off to the side. The furniture was simple but well made, and everything was painfully neat. Too neat, Grace realized. This was a house where only one person lived now, and that person didn't know what to do with all the empty space. "Nathaniel's room is that one," Austin said, pointing to the left. "Mine's on the right, though I suppose they're both mine now." "How are you managing?" Grace asked. "Running the ranch alone." Austin shrugged. "I've hired a hand to help with the heavy work. Young fellow named Tommy Briggs came out from Missouri. Good worker. But yeah, it's harder without Nathaniel. We were partners in everything." Grace walked to the window and looked out at the corrals where several horses grazed peacefully. "What kind of ranch is this?" "We breed horses mostly. Some cattle, but horses are our specialty. Nathaniel had a real gift for it. Could gentle the wildest Mustang you ever saw, and they'd trust him like he was another horse." Austin's voice carried a mix of pride and pain. "I'm decent with horses, but Nathaniel, he was something special." They stayed for another hour, Austin showing her around the property, the barns, the corrals, the creek that ran along the eastern boundary. Grace found herself imagining what it would have been like to live here, to build a life in this stark, beautiful place. On the ride back to town, Grace asked, "Why didn't you remarry after your wife died?" Austin was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. I loved my wife, Caroline, more than I thought it was possible to love another person. When she died, a part of me died too. And then, I had Nathaniel to raise, and that became my whole world. There were women over the years who made it clear they'd be interested, but I couldn't imagine anyone replacing Caroline, and I didn't want Nathaniel to have a mother who was there out of convenience rather than love. That must have been lonely. Sometimes, Austin admitted, but I had my son and I had the ranch, and mostly that was enough. What about you, Miss Olmstead? Why did you decide to come west as a mail-order bride? Grace considered how much to reveal. After my parents died, I found myself dependent on relatives who didn't want me. I worked as a seamstress, but the wages barely covered my board. I had 3 choices: stay in Boston and scrape by, hoping some man might overlook my poverty enough to marry me. Find work as a domestic servant, which would have meant even longer hours for less pay, or take a chance on a new life somewhere else. The advertisement Nathaniel placed made it sound like he wanted a partner, not just a housekeeper or a brood mare. That appealed to me. Nathaniel was raised to respect women, Austin said. I made sure of that. His mother gave her life for him. I wanted him to understand that women are people, not property. That's not a common view out here from what I understand. It's not common anywhere, Austin said dryly. But that doesn't make it wrong. Over the following weeks, Grace settled into her new life in Kingman. Teaching at the schoolhouse turned out to be more rewarding than she'd expected. The children were a mix of miners' kids, ranchers' children, and offspring of the merchants and craftsmen who served the growing town. They were rough around the edges but eager to learn, and Grace found she had a knack for making lessons engaging. Mrs. Peterson warmed to her gradually, and eventually confided that she'd been skeptical about hiring someone who'd come west as a mail-order bride. Thought you might be flighty or desperate, she admitted, but you've proven yourself steady and capable. Austin came to town every week or 2 for supplies, and he always stopped by to check on Grace. Sometimes he brought vegetables from his garden or eggs from his chickens. Once he brought a beautiful piece of turquoise he'd bought from a Navajo trader. Thought you might like it, he said, almost shyly. For a brooch or something. Their friendship deepened gradually, built on conversations during those supply runs and occasional Sunday dinners at Mrs. Chen's boarding house. Grace learned that Austin was widely respected in the area for his fairness and his skill with horses. She heard stories from townspeople about how he'd helped neighbors during hard times, how he'd stood up to claim jumpers trying to muscle out smaller ranchers, how he'd once tracked down a band of horse thieves that had plagued the territory for months. "You never told me you were a tracker," Grace said one evening as they sat on the boarding house porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains. Austin shrugged. "Never came up. It's something I learned young. My father was a scout before he settled in Texas. What else haven't you told me?" He smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling. "Plenty, I expect. We've only known each other a few months, Miss Olmstead. Takes years to really know a person." "Grace," she said. "You should call me Grace. Miss Olmstead sounds so formal." "Grace," he repeated, and something in the way he said her name made her heart skip. "All right then, Grace." It was October when things shifted between them. Grace had been in Kingman for 4 months, and autumn was beginning to cool the brutal desert heat. She'd been invited to a barn dance at the McAllister Ranch, a big event that drew people from all the surrounding homesteads. Austin offered to escort her, and Grace spent an embarrassing amount of time deciding what to wear. She'd brought limited clothing from Boston, but she had a blue dress that brought out her eyes, and Mrs. Chen helped her arrange her auburn hair in a becoming style. When Austin arrived to collect her in his wagon, freshly washed and wearing his good shirt, Grace saw him truly look at her for the first time. Not as his son's intended bride, not as a responsibility, but as a woman. The awareness that flashed in his eyes made her blush. "You look beautiful," he said, and there was a note of surprise in his voice, as if he'd just realized something. "Thank you," Grace managed, suddenly shy. The dance was held in a huge barn that had been cleared of equipment and decorated with paper streamers and lanterns. A fiddle band played lively music, and the crowd was a mix of rough cowboys, farming families, and townspeople dressed in their Sunday best. Grace danced with several of the young men who asked her, but she found herself watching Austin between sets. He moved through the crowd with easy confidence, greeting friends, exchanging news, but he didn't dance. When she finally worked up the courage to ask him why, he looked embarrassed. "Haven't danced in years," he admitted. "Not since Caroline. I'd probably step all over your feet." "I don't mind," Grace said, surprising herself with her boldness. "Just one dance." The fiddle band struck up a waltz, and Austin hesitantly led her onto the floor. He was rusty but not terrible, and Grace found herself enjoying the solid warmth of his hand on her waist, the careful way he guided her through the steps. "See, you remember," she said, smiling up at him. "Some things you don't forget," Austin said, and the way he looked at her made her feel warm all over. They danced 3 more times that evening, and Grace noticed the speculative looks from some of the townspeople. She knew there would be talk. A mail-order bride who'd come for the son, now dancing with the father. But somehow she couldn't bring herself to care. On the ride home, Austin was quiet. Grace wondered if he regretted the dancing, the attention. "I've been thinking," he said finally, as they neared town. "I'm too old for you, Grace. I know that. You're young and beautiful and smart, and you deserve someone closer to your own age. Someone who can give you a long life together, children, all the things a woman should have." Grace felt her stomach drop. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that people are starting to notice how much time we spend together. And I don't want to ruin your reputation or limit your prospects. There are several young men in town who'd court you properly if I wasn't always hovering around. And if I don't want those young men to court me." Austin glanced at her, surprise evident on his face. "Grace, you barely know what you want. You're still grieving the life you thought you'd have with Nathaniel." "I grieved that in the first month," Grace said, frustration sharpening her voice. "What I had with Nathaniel was a dream, a fantasy built on letters and a photograph. I never knew him as a real person. But I know you, Austin. I know you're kind and patient and honest. I know you make me laugh and that I look forward to your visits. I know that when you held me during that waltz, I felt safer and more content than I have in years." The wagon had stopped in front of the boarding house, but neither of them moved. "I'm 48 years old," Austin said quietly. "You're 23. That's a gap of 25 years, Grace." "I can do arithmetic," Grace said. "What I want to know is whether the age gap is your only objection." Austin turned to face her fully, and in the moonlight she could see the war playing out across his features. "No," he admitted. "It's not. Grace, I've been falling for you since the day I met you on that train platform. You're everything good and bright in this world, but I won't trap you into something you might regret. You deserve the chance to explore your options." "I've explored them," Grace said firmly. "Young Tommy Briggs asked if he could call on me. So did the banker's son and 2 of the miners and the new deputy. I said no to all of them because they're not who I want." "Who do you want?" Grace reached across the space between them and took his weathered hand in hers. "I want the man who helped a stranger because it was the right thing to do. I want the man who honors his dead son by taking care of the woman his son chose. I want the man who looks at me like I matter, not just as a pretty face or a potential housekeeper, but as a person whose thoughts and feelings are important. Austin's hand tightened on hers. "Grace, I'm old enough to be your father. You're not my father. And age isn't just a number, it's wisdom and experience and knowing who you are. Those young men who asked to court me, they're still figuring themselves out. You know who you are. You know what you want from life. That's worth more to me than smooth skin and dark hair." "I'll get older while you're still in your prime," Austin said, but his resistance was weakening. "You'll end up taking care of an invalid. Or you'll live into your 80s and I'll benefit from your wisdom for decades to come," Grace countered. "Austin, life doesn't come with guarantees. We could both die tomorrow. What matters is what we do with the time we have." He was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of her hand. "I never thought I'd feel this way about anyone again. After Caroline, I thought that part of my life was over." "Maybe it was supposed to wait," Grace said softly. "Maybe we both had to go through what we went through to be ready for this." Austin lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "If we do this, we do it properly. I'll court you right, let you be sure. No rushing into anything." "I'm already sure," Grace said, "but I understand. We can take our time." True to his word, Austin courted Grace with old-fashioned propriety. He called on her at the boarding house on Sunday afternoons, always bringing small gifts, wildflowers, a book he thought she'd enjoy, a hair comb carved from bone. They took walks through town, attended church services together, and had dinner at Mrs. Chen's under the watchful but approving eye of the boarding house keeper. The townspeople's reaction was mixed. Some thought it romantic, a second chance at love for a good man who'd suffered enough loss. Others whispered that Austin was robbing the cradle, taking advantage of a young woman who'd been in a vulnerable position. Grace learned to ignore the gossip, though Austin struggled with it more. "Maybe they're right," he said one afternoon as they sat by the creek on his property. It was November now, and the weather had cooled enough to make the outdoors pleasant. "Maybe I am taking advantage." "You think you're taking advantage?" Grace asked. "No, I think I'm the luckiest man in Arizona territory." "Then that's all that matters." Grace had her own doubts, though they had nothing to do with Austin's age. She worried that she was just looking for security, that she was settling for friendship and companionship instead of passionate love. But then, Austin would smile at her or share some small observation that showed how well he understood her, and those doubts would fade. It was after a particularly fine Sunday dinner that Austin asked if they could talk privately. They walked to the small park at the edge of town, and Austin guided her to a bench beneath a cottonwood tree. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he began. "About us, about the future. Grace, I know we agreed to take things slow, but I'm 50 years old. I don't have unlimited time to waste." Grace felt her pulse quicken. "What are you saying?" Austin reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Inside was a ring, simple gold with a small diamond. "This was Caroline's," he said quietly. "I know that might seem strange, offering you another woman's ring. But Caroline would have liked you, Grace. She would have wanted her ring to be worn by someone who'd be loved and cherished." "Austin, let me finish," he said gently. "I love you, Grace Olmstead. I love your strength and your kindness and the way you make me laugh. I love how you are with the children at school and how you've built a life for yourself here instead of running back to what was familiar. I know I'm older than you, and I know I can't promise you as many years as a younger man could. But I can promise you that every day we have together, I'll do my best to make you happy. Will you marry me?" Grace felt tears streaming down her cheeks, but they were happy tears. "Yes," she said. "Yes, of course, yes." Austin slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Then he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, gentle and sweet and full of promise. They were married in December, a small ceremony at the church with most of the town in attendance. Grace wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Chen had helped her sew, and Austin wore a new suit that made him look distinguished and handsome. Grace's students from the school threw flower petals as they left the church, and Mrs. Peterson actually smiled. The wedding night at the ranch house was awkward at first, both of them nervous despite their ages. But Austin was patient and gentle, and Grace discovered that desire had nothing to do with age and everything to do with trust and tenderness. "Are you happy?" Austin asked afterward, holding her close in the darkness. "Happier than I ever imagined I could be," Grace said honestly. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Grace continued teaching, though she had to give up her room at the boarding house and make the daily trip to and from the ranch. Austin bought her a gentle mare named Daisy, and Grace learned to ride, something she'd never imagined doing back in Boston. She also learned to be a rancher's wife, which was different from anything she'd known. There was hard physical work involved, cooking for Austin and Tommy Briggs, the hired hand, keeping the house, helping with the garden, even assisting with the horses during busy times. But there was satisfaction in it too, in seeing the direct results of her labor. Austin was an attentive husband, always considerate of her comfort and happiness. He taught her to read the weather, to understand the land, to appreciate the harsh beauty of the desert. They talked for hours in the evenings, sharing their pasts, their dreams, their daily observations. "I never thought I could love again," Austin confessed one night as they lay in bed. "After Caroline died, I thought that part of me died too. But loving you is different. It's deeper, maybe because I'm older and I understand better what a gift it is." "Tell me about Caroline," Grace said. She'd been curious about Austin's first wife but hadn't wanted to pry. Austin was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. She was small and fierce, with dark hair and eyes that could see right through you. "We met at a church social in Texas when I was 21. I knew within 5 minutes I was going to marry her. She was strong, Grace. Strong enough to follow me out here when this was still wild country, strong enough to help build this ranch from nothing. When she got pregnant with Nathaniel, she was so happy. But the birth went wrong. The midwife did everything she could, but Caroline just bled too much. She lived long enough to hold Nathaniel once, to name him, then she was gone." Grace squeezed his hand in the darkness. "I'm sorry you lost her. I was too for a long time. But I had Nathaniel, and he was everything good about her and me combined. Raising him alone was the hardest thing I ever did, but also the most rewarding." Austin paused. Losing him was harder than losing Caroline in some ways. A parent shouldn't outlive their child. "No," Grace agreed softly. "They shouldn't. But if Nathaniel hadn't placed that advertisement, I never would have met you. So even in grief, there can be unexpected blessings." Winter passed and spring came to the desert, bringing wildflowers and new foals. Grace discovered she was pregnant in March, and Austin was both thrilled and terrified. "I'm too old to be starting over with babies," he said, but his hand on her still flat stomach was gentle. "You're the perfect age," Grace countered. "You have wisdom now that you didn't have when Nathaniel was born. Our child will benefit from that." The pregnancy was easier than Grace had feared, though the summer heat was brutal. Austin was attentive to the point of being overprotective, constantly worrying about her comfort and health. He hired a woman from town to help with the heavy housework over Grace's protests. "I'm pregnant, not an invalid," she said. "Humor me," Austin replied. "I lost Caroline in childbirth. I can't lose you too." Grace understood then how deep his fear ran. She stopped protesting and let him fuss, knowing it helped him cope with his anxiety. Their son was born in November, almost exactly a year after their wedding. The birth was long and difficult, but both Grace and the baby came through it safely. Austin wept when the midwife placed the squalling infant in his arms. "A boy," he said wonderingly. "Grace, we have a son." They named him Nathaniel Austin Zimmerman, honoring both the son Austin had lost and the man he'd become. Little Nate, as they called him, had Austin's gray eyes and Grace's auburn hair, and from the beginning he was a content, easy baby. "You're a natural father," Grace observed one evening, watching Austin rock the baby to sleep. "Second time around, I know what I'm doing," Austin said. "And I'm not doing it alone this time. That makes all the difference." Life with a baby was exhausting but joyful. Grace had to give up teaching for a while to care for Nate, but she didn't mind as much as she'd expected. There was something deeply satisfying about building her own family, creating a home filled with love and laughter. Tommy Briggs proved invaluable, taking on more of the ranch work so Austin could help with the baby. He was courting a girl in town named Sarah Miller, and Austin gave him time off to see her, remembering what it was like to be young and in love. "You've gotten soft," Tommy teased one day. "I've gotten happy," Austin corrected. "There's a difference." When Nate was 6 months old, Grace decided to return to teaching part-time. Mrs. Peterson had held her position open, and Grace found she missed the work. Austin's sister Martha, who'd moved to Kingman from Texas, was happy to watch Nate 3 days a week. Martha Zimmerman Foster was a widow in her 50s, pleasant and capable, and she doted on her nephew. She and Grace became close friends, and Martha often shared stories about Austin as a young man. "He was always serious," Martha said one afternoon as they watched Nate play with blocks on the floor. "Even as a boy, he was thoughtful and responsible, took care of me after our mother died, even though he was only 14 and I was 12. He's a good man," Grace said. "The best," Martha agreed. "I was worried when I heard he'd married someone so much younger, thought maybe he was having some kind of crisis. But seeing you two together, I understand. You're good for each other. You bring out a lightness in him I haven't seen since before Caroline died." As Nate grew into a toddler, Grace and Austin settled into the deep contentment of a good marriage. They had their disagreements, of course. Grace thought Austin was too cautious sometimes, while Austin thought Grace could be impulsive. But they'd learned to talk through their differences, to compromise and find middle ground. The ranch prospered. Austin's reputation for breeding quality horses brought buyers from all over the territory. Grace helped with the business side, discovering she had a talent for bookkeeping and correspondence. Together, they built something stronger than either could have managed alone. On their 3rd anniversary, Austin presented Grace with a beautiful silver locket. Inside were tiny photographs, one of Nathaniel the elder, one of baby Nate. "Past and present," Austin said. "Everything that brought us to where we are." Grace threw her arms around his neck, overwhelmed with love for this man who'd shown her that age truly was just a number, that wisdom and kindness mattered more than youth and passion. "I never imagined I could be this happy," she said. "When I stepped off that train 3 years ago, I was so scared and lost. You gave me everything, Austin. A home, a family, a purpose." "You gave me those things too," Austin said. "A reason to hope again, to believe the best parts of my life weren't behind me." They stood together on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and orange. Nate played at their feet, building something elaborate with sticks and stones that only he understood. "You ever think about how different things could have been?" Grace asked. "If Nathaniel had lived," "Sometimes," Austin admitted. "I think you would have been happy with him. He was a good man and he would have loved you well. But I also think, selfishly, that I'm grateful things worked out the way they did. I know that makes me a terrible person." "It makes you human," Grace said. "We can grieve what was lost and still be grateful for what we found." Over the following years, their family grew. Grace had 2 more children, a daughter they named Caroline Martha, born when Grace was 27, and another son, James Oliver, who arrived when Grace was 30. Austin was in his mid-50s by then, and he joked that he was too old to be chasing toddlers around. But he was a devoted father, patient and playful in ways he admitted he hadn't been with young Nathaniel. "I was so young myself then," he explained. "So worried about providing, about being a good father, that I forgot to just enjoy him. I won't make that mistake again." Grace watched Austin teach Nate to ride, saw him read bedtime stories to Caroline, listened to him singing lullabies to baby James, and felt her heart swell with love. This was what she'd dreamed of when she'd responded to that mail-order bride advertisement. A real partnership, a true family, a home built on love and respect. The children grew up strong and happy. Nate showed his grandfather's talent with horses and his father's serious nature. Caroline was fierce and independent, keeping her brothers in line. James was the baby, sweet and affectionate, loved by everyone. As Austin moved into his 60s, he began to slow down physically, though his mind remained sharp. Grace took on more of the ranch management, working closely with Tommy Briggs, who'd married Sarah and built his own small house on the property. It was a natural transition, Austin gradually stepping back and letting the younger generation take over. "You regret it?" Austin asked Grace one evening when he was 65 and she was 40. They sat on the porch, watching their children play in the yard. Nate was 18 now and courting a girl from town. Caroline was 14 and more interested in horses than boys. James was 11 and obsessed with reading every book he could get his hands on. "Regret what?" Grace asked. "Marrying an old man. You're still young and beautiful, and I'm getting creaky and gray." Grace laughed and took his hand, threading her fingers through his. "Austin Zimmerman, you are the best decision I ever made. Yes, you're older than me. Yes, I'll probably outlive you by years, but every single day we've had together has been worth it. You taught me what real love looks like, not the fairy tale version, but the everyday kind that's built on trust and friendship and choosing each other again and again." "I love you," Austin said simply. "More now than the day we married." "I love you too," Grace said. "Age doesn't change that. If anything, it makes it stronger." They sat in companionable silence, hands linked, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. This was what mattered, Grace thought. Not the years they'd have together, but the depth of the connection they'd built. Austin had shown her that age meant wisdom, that an older man could offer things a young one couldn't. Patience, understanding, a deep knowledge of himself and what he wanted from life. When Grace was 45 and Austin was 70, they celebrated their 22nd wedding anniversary with their children and grandchildren. Nate had married and given them 2 grandchildren. Caroline had shocked everyone by becoming a horse trader, traveling throughout the territory buying and selling stock. James was studying to be a lawyer in Prescott. Austin's health had declined somewhat, though he was still mentally sharp and physically capable for his age. He walked with a slight limp from an old riding injury, and he tired more easily, but he was content. "I've lived a good life," he told Grace that night as they prepared for bed. "Better than I deserved. I got to raise 1 son and watch 3 more children grow up. I built a successful ranch. And most importantly, I got to love 2 incredible women who both loved me back." "Don't talk like you're dying," Grace said, though she knew the truth. Austin was 70, and the hard life of a rancher took its toll. He'd likely have a few more good years, maybe more if they were lucky, but their time was growing shorter. "I'm not dying yet," Austin said, "but I'm old enough to know that it's important to say the things that matter while you can. Grace, you gave me a second life when I thought my best years were behind me. You made me a father again, a husband again. You reminded me that it's never too late for happiness." Grace held him close that night, memorizing the feel of him, the smell of him, the steady beat of his heart. Whatever time they had left, she would treasure every moment. Austin lived to be 76, a good long life by any standard. He died peacefully in his sleep on a cool spring morning, Grace beside him. They'd had 28 years of marriage, more than many couples got even when they wed young. The funeral was huge, testament to how many lives Austin had touched. Ranchers came from all over the territory. Townspeople Grace had known for decades brought food and shared stories. Tommy Briggs, now in his 50s and running the ranch day to day, wept openly. Grace grieved, but it was a clean grief, not complicated by regrets or things left unsaid. She'd loved Austin fully, and he'd loved her the same way. They'd built a life together, raised children, created something lasting. In the months after Austin's death, Grace found comfort in her children and grandchildren. Nate ran the ranch now with Caroline's help when she was home from her travels. James had become a successful lawyer in Prescott and visited often. Grace lived another 15 years, dying peacefully at the age of 68, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. In her final days, she often spoke of Austin, remembering their life together with joy rather than sadness. The ranch stayed in the family for generations, a testament to what Austin and Grace had built together. The story of the mail-order bride who'd come for the son but married the father became local legend, a reminder that love could bloom in unexpected places, and that age was no barrier to finding true happiness. On Grace's headstone, beside Austin's in the small cemetery outside Kingman, her children had inscribed a simple epitaph. "She came west looking for one kind of life and found something better. Beloved wife, mother, and teacher, together with Austin again." The desert wind blew across the graves, carrying the scent of sage and wildflowers. The ranch house still stood strong, home now to Grace and Austin's great-great-grandchildren, who knew the story of how their family began with a twist of fate, and a mail-order bride who learned that sometimes the unexpected path leads exactly where you're meant to be. In the end, Grace had been right all those years ago on the boarding house porch. Age was just a number. What mattered was wisdom, kindness, and the courage to take a chance on love, no matter what form it took. Austin had shown her that an older man could offer gifts a younger one couldn't. Patience born of experience, confidence earned through years of living, and a deep appreciation for the preciousness of time. Their love story wasn't conventional, but it was true and deep and lasting. And in the wild west town of Kingman, Arizona Territory, it became the kind of story people told around fires and dinner tables, a reminder that love could find you when you least expected it, in forms you never imagined, and that sometimes the best things in life came from taking a leap of faith. The mail-order bride had expected a young man, but the older cowboy who met her at the train station had shown her something far more valuable than youth. He'd shown her that age meant wisdom, that experience meant understanding, and that real love grew stronger with time rather than fading. It was a lesson Grace carried with her all her days, and one she passed down to her children and grandchildren. Never judge a person by their years, but by the content of their character and the depth of their heart. And so the story ended. not with a dramatic climax, but with the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived, a love well earned, and a legacy that would endure for generations. Grace Olmstead had stepped off a train in Kingman expecting one future and found another, infinitely better one. And Austin Zimmerman, who thought his chance at love had died with his first wife, discovered that the heart could open again, could love again, could build again, no matter how many years had passed. Their story was proof that in the vast desert landscape of the American West, where life was hard and survival was never guaranteed, love could still flourish. It just sometimes took wisdom to recognize it, courage to embrace it, and faith to believe that age was no barrier to happiness. That was the true legacy of Grace and Austin Zimmerman, a legacy written not just in the land they'd worked or the children they'd raised, but in the example they'd set of what real, lasting, transformative love looked like.